picture this. It's October 8th, 1871, and you've just woken up in Chicago to what looks like the end of the world. The sky is the color of burnt copper, ash falls like snow in July, and the air tastes like every campfire that ever existed decided to have a reunion in your lungs. You think you're having a bad day? Well, buckle up, because today we're exploring why you absolutely, positively, would not have survived the Great Chicago Fire. So go ahead, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, because tonight we're taking you back to when Chicago literally went up in smoke. And trust me, you're going to want the comfort of your modern world after this journey. Why you wouldn't survive the Great Chicago Fire. The year is 1871, and you're living in what people optimistically call the Windy City. Though after today, they might start calling it the Crispy City. Chicago is booming, a sprawling metropolis of wooden dreams and timber nightmares, where nearly everything that could burn was practically begging for a match. You wake up this particular Sunday morning completely unaware that by nightfall, you'll either be running for your life through streets that look like the surface of hell, or you'll be nothing more than a statistic in what will become one of America's most devastating urban disasters. Let's start with your house, shall we? If you're like most Chicagoans in 1871, you're living in a wooden structure that's about as fire-resistant as a pile of kindling soaked in whiskey. The city planners, bless their naive hearts, had decided that wood was the perfect building material for a rapidly growing city. Wooden houses, wooden sidewalks, wooden streets, wooden everything. It's as if the entire city was constructed by someone who had never heard the phrase fire hazard. Your home isn't just built of wood, it's built of the driest, most combustible wood available, seasoned by months of drought that had turned Chicago into essentially a 200-square-mile tinderbox. The summer of 1871 had been brutal. We're talking about a drought so severe that the Chicago River was running lower than a snake's belly, and the city's fire department was already exhausted from battling smaller blazes that seemed to pop up daily like unwelcome surprises. By October, Chicago hadn't seen significant rainfall in months. The wooden structures weren't just dry, they were practically mummified. Your house, your neighbor's house, the saloon down the street, even the sidewalks beneath your feet, everything contained about as much moisture as a desert bone. Now, imagine you're going about your Sunday evening routine. Maybe you're reading the Chicago Tribune by candlelight, completely unaware that somewhere across town, a fire that started small is about to become very, very large. The wind, Chicago's famous wind, is picking up. This isn't just any breeze, mind you. We're talking about gusts that could knock a grown man sideways, winds that turn small fires into raging infernos faster than you can say, urban planning mistake. The fire doesn't announce itself politely. There's no gentle knock on your door, no neighborly warning. Instead, the first sign you get that something's wrong is probably the smell. It starts as something distant. Maybe you think someone's having a particularly ambitious barbecue, but then it gets stronger, more acrid, more urgent. It's the smell of Chicago itself burning, a cocktail of burning wood, tar, coal, and things you'd rather not think about. By the time you realize something's seriously wrong, you can see the glow on the horizon. It's not the gentle orange of a cozy fireplace. It's the angry red of destruction incarnate, climbing into the night sky like some terrible sunrise happening at the wrong end of the day. The wind is carrying embers, glowing fragments of other people's lives and livelihoods, raining down on your neighborhood like hellish snow. You step outside, and the heat hits you like walking into an oven. The air itself seems to be on fire, so hot and dry it hurts to breathe. Your lungs feel like they're being sandpapered from the inside. and every breath tastes like smoke and ash and the bitter temps of destruction. The wind isn't just moving air anymore. It's moving a wall of superheated death that's consuming everything in its path. Now comes your first life or death decision. What do you save? You've got minutes, maybe less, before the fire reaches your block. Do you grab your money, your family photographs, your Sunday best? Here's the thing that people never really understand about disasters like this. You can't think clearly when your world is literally burning down around you. Your brain, which normally does a decent job of making rational decisions, suddenly turns into a panicked squirrel running in circles. Most people, faced with this impossible choice, make the worst possible decision. They try to save everything. They waste precious minutes stuffing belongings into trunks that they'll never be able to carry, gathering up possessions that will slow them down or, worse yet, trap them in a burning building. The smart ones, the survivors, grab whatever they can carry in their arms and run. But you're not thinking like a survivor yet, because you still don't really understand what you're facing. The streets are chaos. Imagine every disaster movie you've ever seen. Then multiply the panic by 10 and add the very real possibility that the ground itself might catch fire. People are running in every direction. Some toward the fire because they don't know which way it's coming from. Others standing frozen in the street like deer caught in headlights made of flames. Horses are rearing and screaming, their animal instincts correctly telling them that this situation is very, very bad. Wagons are overturned, belongings scattered everywhere, and through it all, the fire keeps coming. The noise is indescribable. It's not just the crackling of burning wood, it's the roar of a living thing, a monster that feeds on everything Chicago has to offer. Buildings don't just burn, they explode. Windows shatter from the heat before the fire even reaches them. The sound of a city dying is something no human ear was meant to process, a symphony of destruction that drowns out screams, shouts, and the thunder of thousands of feet running on wooden streets that are themselves beginning to smolder. You're trying to run, but where? The fire isn't coming from just one direction anymore. It's everywhere, jumping from building to building with the help of those relentless winds, moving faster than any human can run. The streets you've walked your entire life are now corridors of death, and the familiar landmarks that used to guide you home are disappearing in pillars of flame and smoke. The heat is becoming unbearable. It's not just warm, it's physically crushing, pressing against you like an invisible weight. Your clothes are starting to smoke, your hair is singed, and breathing becomes an act of will. Every breath burns your throat and lungs, and you realize with growing horror that the air itself is becoming poisonous. The smoke isn't just annoying, it's deadly, filled with toxic fumes from burning everything from houses to businesses to the tar that paved the streets. Here's where most people would have died, and here's why you would too. The fire moves faster than you can think, faster than you can run, faster than you can make decisions. By the time you realize you need to escape, your escape routes are already cut off. The bridges are burning, the streets are rivers of fire, and every direction looks like the mouth of hell. Let's say you make it to the Chicago River, thinking water means safety. Congratulations, you've just discovered that rivers can burn too. The surface of the Chicago River was covered with a layer of oil, grease, and other flammable liquids that had been dumped there by the city's industries. When the fire reached the river, even the water caught fire. People jumped in to escape the flames only to find themselves swimming in liquid fire, if you can even call that swimming. But wait, there's more. The fire isn't just destroying buildings and streets, it's creating its own weather. The heat is so intense, it's generating its own wind patterns. creating fire tornadoes that spin through the streets like something out of a fever dream. These aren't just dramatic special effects, they're real meteorological phenomena that can pick up burning debris and hurl it for miles, starting new fires faster than the previous ones can be contained. The psychological toll is something no one talks about in the history books. Imagine watching your entire world disappear in the space of a few hours. Your home, your neighborhood, your workplace, all the familiar places that make up your daily existence, gone. Not just damaged, not just changed, but completely erased as if they never existed. The landmarks you use to navigate your life have been replaced by smoking ruins and ash drifts that look like snow but burn when you touch them. And we haven't even talked about the other people yet. Disaster brings out both the best and worst in humanity. And in a situation like this, you're going to see both in their most extreme forms. Some people will help strangers, share their resources, risk their lives to save others. Others will rob, cheat, and abandon their own families to save themselves. In the chaos of the Great Chicago Fire, you couldn't tell which kind of person someone was until it was too late. The city's infrastructure collapsed almost immediately. There was no organized evacuation, no emergency services coordinating rescue efforts, no reliable communication system to tell people where to go or what to do. The fire department, already exhausted from fighting smaller fires, was quickly overwhelmed. Their equipment was designed for house fires, not for the complete destruction of an entire metropolitan area. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. Food and water became immediate problems. The fire didn't just destroy homes, it destroyed the systems that kept the city alive. Water mains burst from the heat, wells were contaminated with ash and debris, and food supplies were either burned up or spoiled by smoke and ash. People who survived the initial fire found themselves facing starvation and dehydration in the days that followed. The weather wasn't helping either. That wind we mentioned, it wasn't just moving the fire around, it was making survival a nightmare in other ways too. The combination of wind, heat, and smoke created a toxic atmosphere that made breathing difficult, even if you were nowhere near the actual flames. People died not from burning, but from smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion, and simply being overwhelmed by the impossibility of their situation. Let's talk about something the sanitized history books don't often mention: the smell. We've talked about smoke, but we haven't really discussed what Chicago smelled like as it burned. It wasn't just wood smoke, which would have been bad enough. It was the smell of everything a city contains, burning at once. Paint, chemicals, food, fabric, leather, coal, oil, and yes, sometimes worse things. The smell was so overwhelming that people miles away from the fire reported being nauseated by it. Imagine living in that smell, breathing it, having it saturate your clothes and hair and skin. Before we continue with more of the horrors you would have faced, let's take a moment to check in with our community. Where are you checking in from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let us know. If you're truly enjoying these boring history stories, this quiet corner of the internet where we explore the darker chapters of human experience, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to join our growing community. And speaking of community, what historical disaster or period would you like us to explore next? Your suggestions help shape these journeys we take together through the more sobering moments of our past. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continued support. And thank you for being part of our little corner of the internet, where we remember that history isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth understanding. The physical challenges you'd face trying to survive weren't just about avoiding the fire itself. The smoke was a killer in its own right, thick and choking, and filled with particles that would tear up your lungs. Visibility was reduced to mere feet in some areas, meaning you could walk straight into danger without seeing it coming. People got lost in their own neighborhoods because familiar streets were shrouded in impenetrable smoke that turned day into night and made navigation impossible. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Temperatures in the fire zone reached levels that could kill you just from exposure, even if the flames never touched you. Your body's cooling system simply can't handle that kind of heat, especially when you're exerting yourself trying to run or carry belongings. Heat stroke became as much of a threat as the fire itself, and many people collapsed from overheating long before they reached safety. Finding shelter was nearly impossible. The buildings that weren't burning were either too dangerous to enter because they were about to burn, or they were already packed with other refugees who had the same idea you did. Public buildings that might normally serve as emergency shelters were themselves under threat. Even the supposedly safe stone buildings weren't actually safe, as the intense heat could cause stone to crack and collapse, and the wooden interiors burned just as readily as anything else. The psychological strain of watching your city die around you cannot be overstated. This wasn't just a fire, it was the complete erasure of the world as you knew it. Streets you'd walked your entire life were unrecognizable rivers of flame. Buildings where you worked, shopped, worshipped, and socialized were becoming memories in real time. The very geography of your existence was being rewritten by fire, and your brain simply wasn't equipped to process that level of change happening so quickly. Communication was impossible. There were no cell phones, no emergency broadcast systems, no way to coordinate with family members or friends or even authorities. If you got separated from your loved ones in the chaos, you had no way to find them or even know if they were alive. Imagine the terror of not knowing if your children made it out of the city, or if your parents were trapped somewhere in the inferno, and having absolutely no way to find out. The fire moved so unpredictably that even if you thought you'd found a safe route, it could be cut off within minutes. The wind patterns created by the fire itself meant that flames could suddenly appear in areas that had been clear just moments before. Burning debris carried by the wind could start new fires miles ahead of the main blaze, meaning you could run toward what looked like safety only to find that safety had already been compromised. Transportation was a nightmare. The few available wagons and carriages were either commandeered by those with money and influence, or they were stuck in traffic jams of panicked people that moved slower than walking. Horses, being smarter than humans in some ways, often refused to move toward the fire, making them useless for evacuation. Many people abandoned their belongings and their transport animals, choosing to flee on foot rather than waste time fighting with terrified horses. The roads themselves were becoming dangerous. Wooden streets and sidewalks were starting to smolder and smoke, and in some cases, actually catching fire. The tar used to seal roads melted and bubbled, creating sticky traps that could slow your escape. Debris from burning buildings constantly fell into the streets, creating obstacles and hazards that could injure or trap fleeing residents. Water, that most basic necessity for human survival, became both scarce and dangerous. The city's water system was compromised almost immediately, leaving people with no reliable source of clean drinking water. The rivers and lake were contaminated with ash, debris, and runoff from the fire. People were faced with the choice of drinking potentially poisonous water or facing dehydration, and neither option was particularly appealing. The social fabric of the city unraveled as quickly as its physical structure. Normal social conventions and laws meant nothing when everyone was focused on survival. Property rights became meaningless when property itself was disappearing. People took whatever they needed to survive, and the normal mechanisms for maintaining order, the police and municipal authorities, were either overwhelmed or evacuating themselves. Medical care was non-existent. Hospitals were evacuated or burned, doctors were fleeing like everyone else, and medical supplies were destroyed along with everything else. If you were injured during your escape attempt, whether from falling, debris, smoke, inhalation, burns, or simple exhaustion, you were on your own. There was no 911 to call, no emergency rooms to run to, no paramedics coming to help. The fire created its own ecosystem of survival, where the normal rules of civilization were suspended and replaced by the much harsher rules of natural disaster. The strong survived, the prepared had better chances, and the unlucky died regardless of their character or worthiness. It was nature at its most ruthless, stripping away all the comfortable illusions of urban civilization and reducing human existence to its most basic elements. Can you run fast enough, think clearly enough, and endure long enough to stay alive? This is why you wouldn't have survived the Great Chicago Fire. Not because you're not brave or clever or strong enough, but because the fire was bigger than any individual human's capacity to survive it. It was a force of nature that consumed everything in its path with an appetite that couldn't be satisfied by human sacrifice or ingenuity. It was the kind of disaster that reminds us how fragile our civilized world really is, and how quickly everything we take for granted can be reduced to ash and memory. Tomorrow, we'll explore the heart of this catastrophe, the stories of those who lived through it, and the incredible human drama that unfolded as Chicago burned. But for now, rest easy in your fire-safe home, with your working sprinkler systems and professional fire departments and modern building codes. And remember that sometimes the most boring history is boring because it's too terrible to be exciting. The woman who didn't start the fire, the legend that wouldn't die. Now that we've explored why you absolutely wouldn't have survived the Great Chicago Fire, let's turn our attention to perhaps the most misunderstood person in all of American disaster history, Catherine O'Leary, the Irish immigrant woman who became the unwilling scapegoat for one of the most devastating urban fires in human history. Her story is one of prejudice, media manipulation, and how a single lie can destroy a life more thoroughly than any fire ever could. Catherine O'Leary was 44 years old in 1871, a working-class Irish Catholic woman living on Decauvin Street on Chicago's southwest, side with her husband Patrick and their children. She was what people in those days would have called respectable poor, the kind of woman who worked hard, kept her family fed, and asked for nothing from anyone. Catherine ran a small dairy business out of her home, keeping a few cows in a barn behind her house and selling milk to neighbors who couldn't afford to buy from the larger commercial dairies. This was not an unusual arrangement in 1871 Chicago. The city was still rough around the edges, still growing so fast that rural and urban life existed side by side. Plenty of families kept livestock, and small-scale dairy operations like Catherine's were scattered throughout the working-class neighborhoods. She was just one of thousands of immigrants trying to build a better life in America through hard work and determination. On the evening of October 8, 1871, Catherine O'Leary was not milking her cow. She was not in her barn at all. She was in her house, probably doing the same things millions of working mothers did every Sunday evening, cleaning up from dinner, getting children ready for bed, preparing for another week of work. She had no idea that within hours her name would be known across the entire country, that she would become the most hated woman in Chicago, or that for the rest of her life she would be blamed for a disaster that killed hundreds of people and left thousands homeless. The fire did start somewhere near Catherine's property, that much is true. But the exact circumstances of how it began remain a mystery that has never been definitively solved. What we do know is that around 8:30 that evening, flames were spotted coming from the area of the O'Leary barn. A neighbor, Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, claimed he saw the fire first and ran to alert the family and help fight the initial blaze. Sullivan's story was that he was sitting on the sidewalk across the street when he noticed flames coming from the O'Leary barn. He said he ran to the barn, found it already well involved in fire, and managed to save one calf before the smoke and heat drove him back. According to Sullivan, he then ran to alert the O'Learys, who came out to help fight the fire with buckets of water from a nearby well. But Sullivan's story had problems, inconsistencies that investigators noted even at the time. How had he managed to cross the street, run to the barn, assess the situation, save a calf, and alert the family all in the span of a few minutes? His wooden leg should have slowed him down considerably, yet he claimed to have moved with remarkable speed and efficiency. Some people suspected that Sullivan himself might have accidentally started the fire while visiting the barn, perhaps to steal milk or just to smoke a pipe out of the wind. Other theories emerged quickly. Some blamed a group of men who had been gambling in the barn, suggesting that a knocked-over lantern or carelessly discarded cigar had started the blaze. Others pointed to the O'Leary's neighbors, the McLaughlins, who had been hosting a party that evening and whose guests might have wandered into the barn for various reasons. A few even suggested that the fire was deliberately set, though by whom and why was never made clear. What is absolutely certain is that Catherine O'Leary was not in the barn when the fire started. Multiple witnesses, including her own family members, confirmed that she was in the house when the alarm was raised. She was not milking her cow, she was not carrying a lantern, and she certainly was not kicking over lanterns in a fit of carelessness. The famous image of Mrs. O'Leary milking her cow when the lantern was kicked over is complete fiction. A story that was invented by a newspaper reporter and then repeated so many times it became accepted as historical fact. The reporter responsible for this devastating lie was Michael Ahern of the Chicago Tribune. Years later, in 1893, Ahern would admit publicly that he had completely fabricated the story about Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. He said he had made it up to make his story more colorful and interesting, never imagining that his fictional account would become the accepted version of events. But by then, the damage was done. Catherine O'Leary had spent over 20 years being blamed for a disaster she didn't cause, based on a story that wasn't even true. Why did people so readily believe and spread this false story? The answer lies in the prejudices and social tensions of 1871 Chicago. Catherine O'Leary was Irish at a time when Irish immigrants faced tremendous discrimination in American cities. She was Catholic in a predominantly Protestant society that viewed Catholicism with suspicion and hostility. She was poor in a city increasingly divided between the wealthy elite and the working-class masses. And she was a woman in an era when women were often blamed for disasters and social problems they had no control over. The Irish in particular were convenient scapegoats for urban problems in 19th century America. They were seen as dirty, lazy, prone to drink, and generally inferior to the established Protestant population. Anti-Irish sentiment was so strong that no Irish need apply signs were common in business windows, and Irish immigrants were routinely excluded from decent jobs and housing. When something went wrong, blaming the Irish was almost automatic. The story of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow also fit perfectly into existing stereotypes about Irish people and their supposed carelessness and ignorance. The image of a simple Irish woman carelessly kicking over a lantern while milking her cow played into every prejudice Americans held about Irish immigrants. It suggested they were too stupid and clumsy to be trusted with the basic responsibilities of urban life. But Catherine O'Leary was neither stupid nor careless. She was a successful small business owner who had been operating her dairy for years without incident. She knew how to handle livestock, how to work safely around lanterns and other fire hazards, and how to manage the practical details of running a business. The idea that she would carelessly kick over a lantern while milking is absurd to anyone who understands how dairy operations actually work. The media coverage of the fire and Catherine's role in it was relentless and brutal. Newspaper after newspaper repeated the false story, often embellishing it with additional details that made Catherine look even more careless and irresponsible. Some versions had her drunk while milking, others had her arguing with the cow. Still others suggested she had been careless with the lantern because she was rushing through her chores. Political cartoons of the era depicted Catherine as a stereotypical Irish peasant woman, often shown with the exaggerated features that characterized anti-Irish propaganda of the time. She was drawn as fat, ugly, and stupid, surrounded by the chaos and destruction her supposed carelessness had caused. These images were reprinted in newspapers across the country, making Catherine O'Leary one of the most recognizable faces in America, and not in a good way. The psychological toll on Catherine and her family was enormous. They became prisoners in their own neighborhood, afraid to go out in public because of the hatred and blame directed at them. Catherine stopped giving interviews to reporters after the initial coverage, realizing that nothing she said would change the narrative that had already been established. She retreated into her home and her family, trying to shield her children from the consequences of a lie she had no power to correct. The O'Leary family faced financial ruin as well as social ostracism. Catherine's dairy business collapsed as customers refused to buy milk from the woman they blamed for burning down their city. Patrick O'Leary found it difficult to get work because of his association with his wife's supposed crime. The family, who had been working their way toward middle-class respectability before the fire, found themselves pushed back into poverty by circumstances completely beyond their control. Death threats were common. People would gather outside the O'Leary house, sometimes shouting accusations and demands that the family leave Chicago. Catherine received letters threatening violence against her and her children if she didn't confess to starting the fire. The police provided little protection, partly because they were overwhelmed by the post-fire chaos, and partly because many officers shared the public's belief that Catherine was responsible for the disaster. The legal system offered no relief, although no criminal charges were ever filed against Catherine. She was named in numerous civil lawsuits seeking damages for losses in the fire. Property owners, insurance companies, and individual citizens all tried to hold her financially responsible for the destruction. While most of these lawsuits were ultimately unsuccessful, they kept the O'Learys tied up in legal proceedings for years and added to their financial burden. Catherine's children suffered perhaps the worst consequences of the false accusations. They were taunted at school, excluded from social activities, and forced to defend their mother against accusations they were too young to fully understand. The older children had to leave school early to work and help support the family after Catherine's business collapsed. Their opportunities for education and advancement were cut short by prejudice and false blame. The story took on a life of its own, growing and changing with each retelling. By the 1880s, some versions had Catherine deliberately starting the fire out of spite or madness. Others suggested she was part of a larger conspiracy to destroy Chicago. Still others claimed she had been drunk or mentally unstable when she supposedly kicked over the lantern. Each new variation made the original lie more elaborate and more damaging to Catherine's reputation. folk songs and popular stories spread the tale across the country and around the world. "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight" became a popular song that referenced the fire and implicitly blamed Catherine for the disaster. Children's stories and school textbooks repeated the cow and lantern story as historical fact, ensuring that new generations would grow up believing the lie. Catherine herself became increasingly reclusive as the years passed. She gave up trying to correct the record, realizing that the truth was no match for a story that people wanted to believe. She moved several times within Chicago, hoping to escape the notoriety, but the story always followed her. Neighbors would recognize her and spread word that Mrs. O'Leary, the woman who started the Great Fire, was living nearby. The impact on Catherine's marriage and family relationships was severe. Patrick O'Leary, who had initially defended his wife publicly, eventually stopped talking about the fire altogether. The constant stress and financial pressure put enormous strain on their relationship. Some of their children changed their names as adults to escape the association with the fire, while others moved away from Chicago entirely. In her later years, Catherine became something of a hermit, rarely leaving her house except for necessities. She stopped attending church regularly, partly because of the stares and whispers she encountered there. She aged prematurely, her hair turning white and her health declining under the constant stress of being America's most hated woman for a crime she didn't commit. Catherine O'Leary died in 1895, 24 years after the fire, still carrying the burden of a lie that had destroyed her life as thoroughly as the fire had destroyed Chicago. She never lived to see Michael Ahearn's confession that the story was false, never received the public apology she deserved, and never had her name cleared in the popular imagination. She died as she had lived for over 2 decades, as the woman who supposedly started the Great Chicago Fire. The tragedy of Catherine O'Leary's story extends far beyond one woman's suffering. It represents the broader patterns of scapegoating and prejudice that have characterized American responses to disasters throughout our history. When something terrible happens, people need someone to blame, and that someone is usually chosen not based on evidence or logic, but based on who is most vulnerable, most different, most convenient to hate. Catherine's story also illustrates the power of media to create and destroy reputations, to turn fiction into accepted fact, and to ruin lives in pursuit of a good story. Michael Ahearn's casual invention of the cow and lantern story shows how easily false narratives can take root and grow, especially when they confirm existing prejudices and stereotypes. The real Catherine O'Leary was a hard-working immigrant woman who had the misfortune to live near where a fire started and to belong to a group that was already despised by much of American society. She became a symbol not of carelessness or ignorance, but of how quickly the American dream can turn into an American nightmare when prejudice and false stories combine to destroy an innocent person's life. The ripple effects of the false story extended far beyond Catherine herself, affecting her extended family and the broader Irish community in Chicago. Her siblings and cousins found themselves tainted by association, facing discrimination in employment and social situations simply because they shared the O'Leary name. Irish immigrants, who had been slowly gaining acceptance in Chicago society, suddenly found themselves facing renewed prejudice, as the fire reinforced negative stereotypes about their community's supposed recklessness and inability to adapt to civilized urban life. The economic consequences for the O'Leary family were particularly devastating in ways that modern Americans might struggle to understand. In 1871, there was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no government assistance for families facing financial ruin through no fault of their own. When Catherine's dairy business collapsed, The family had no fallback options. They couldn't simply move to another city and start over because the story had spread nationally. They couldn't declare bankruptcy and get a fresh start because bankruptcy laws were much harsher and offered little protection for working-class families. Patrick O'Leary, Catherine's husband, found himself in an impossible position. As the man of the family, he was expected to provide for his wife and children. But his association with the supposed cause of Chicago's greatest disaster made him virtually unemployable. Potential employers would recognize the name and refuse to hire him, not wanting to be associated with the family that had burned down Chicago. He took whatever work he could find, often jobs that paid far less than his skills merited, and the family's standard of living plummeted. The psychological impact on the O'Leary children cannot be overstated. Growing up as the children of America's most hated woman shaped their entire worldview and life experiences. They learned early that the world was unfair, that truth mattered less than perception, and that sometimes good people suffered for no reason at all. Some of the children internalized the shame and blame, wondering if perhaps their mother really had done something wrong. Others became fiercely protective of her memory, but carried anger and resentment that affected their relationships throughout their lives. The full story also had broader implications for how Americans understood disaster and responsibility. The cow and lantern narrative suggested that major catastrophes could be traced to simple human carelessness, which was both comforting and terrifying. It was comforting because it implied that disasters were preventable if people were just more careful, but terrifying because it suggested that any moment of inattention could lead to unthinkable consequences. This mindset contributed to a culture of blame and scapegoating that affected how Americans responded to subsequent disasters. Catherine's daily life after the fire was marked by a constant awareness of being watched and judged. Neighbors would peer through their windows when she walked by, whispering to each other about the woman who had supposedly caused so much death and destruction. Shopkeepers would serve her reluctantly, if at all, and often charged her higher prices because they knew she had few alternatives. Children would follow her on the street, sometimes throwing stones or shouting accusations they had learned from their parents. The isolation took a severe toll on Catherine's mental health. She became increasingly withdrawn and suspicious, never knowing when someone might recognize her, or when a casual conversation might turn into an accusation or confrontation. She developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Though such conditions were not understood or treated in the 1870s, she had trouble sleeping, suffered from anxiety and depression, and experienced physical symptoms of chronic stress that affected her health for the rest of her life. Perhaps most tragically, Catherine lived her entire remaining life knowing the truth but being powerless to make others believe it. She knew she had not been in the barn when the fire started, knew she had not been milking her cow, knew the entire story was a fabrication. But knowledge of the truth only made her suffering worse, because she could see clearly how a lie had destroyed not just her reputation, but her family's entire future. She died carrying the burden of being blamed for something she not only didn't do, but couldn't possibly have done. Her story reminds us that behind every historical disaster, behind every tragedy that makes headlines and enters folklore, there are real people whose lives are changed forever by events beyond their control. Catherine O'Leary didn't start the Great Chicago Fire, but she paid the price for it anyway, becoming one of history's most unfairly maligned figures and a victim not just of circumstance, but of the very human need to find someone to blame when the unthinkable happens. The unsolved mystery, what really started the Great Chicago Fire. We've explored why you wouldn't have survived this catastrophic fire, and we've uncovered the tragic story of Catherine O'Leary, the innocent woman who became history's most unfair scapegoat. Now we turn to one of the most enduring mysteries in American disaster history. What actually started the Great Chicago Fire? After more than 150 years, countless investigations, and endless speculation, we still don't know for certain what ignited the flames that would consume a city and change the course of American urban development forever. The mystery begins with a simple but frustrating fact. Every single witness to the fire's actual beginning told a different story. And many of those stories changed over time as people's memories became clouded by trauma, influenced by media coverage, or simply worn down by the passage of years. What we're left with is a collection of contradictory accounts, suspicious coincidences, and tantalizing clues that have kept historians, investigators, and amateur detectives busy for generations. Let's start with what we know for absolutely certain. The fire began sometime around 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, October 8, 1871, in or very near the barn behind the O'Leary House at 137 Decavan Street on Chicago's southwest side. The barn contained hay, feed, and probably some farm equipment, all highly flammable materials that would have provided perfect fuel for a fire once it got started. There were several cows in the barn, along with a horse and possibly some other livestock. The first person to report seeing the fire was Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, a neighbor who lived across the street from the O'Learys. Sullivan claimed he was sitting outside his house, enjoying the evening air, when he noticed flames coming from the direction of the O'Leary barn. According to his story, he immediately ran to investigate, found the barn well involved in fire, managed to save one calf, and then alerted the O'Leary family. But Sullivan's story has problems that have troubled investigators for decades. First, there's the question of timing and distance. Sullivan claimed he was able to spot the fire, run approximately 200 feet to the barn, assess the situation, enter a burning building to save an animal, and then run to the O'Leary house to alert the family, all within a matter of minutes. This would have been challenging for any man, but Sullivan had a wooden leg that should have significantly slowed his movement. More troubling are the inconsistencies in Sullivan's various retellings of the events. In some versions, he saved a calf. In others, he saved multiple animals. Sometimes he claimed to have entered the barn. Other times he said the heat and smoke prevented him from getting inside. He gave different descriptions of exactly where he was sitting when he first spotted the flames, and different accounts of how much of the barn was already on fire when he arrived. These inconsistencies have led many researchers to suspect that Sullivan was more involved in the fire's origin than he admitted. Some theories suggest he was in or near the barn when the fire started, perhaps smoking a pipe or engaging in some activity he didn't want to admit to. When the fire began, possibly due to his own carelessness, he may have tried to put it out before finally giving up and creating the story about spotting it from across the street. One particularly intriguing aspect of Sullivan's story is his claim about saving the calf. Multiple witnesses confirmed that a calf was indeed saved from the fire, but the logistics of this rescue raise questions. How did Sullivan manage to locate and lead a frightened animal out of a smoke-filled, burning barn? How did he avoid being overcome by smoke or injured by falling debris? And why would his first instinct be to save livestock rather than immediately alert the human occupants of the nearby house? Another curious detail is that Sullivan apparently knew exactly where to find the O'Learys in their house. Despite the late hour and the fact that he wasn't particularly close to the family, he went straight to their door and immediately got their attention, suggesting either remarkable luck or prior knowledge of the family's evening routines. This has led some investigators to wonder if Sullivan had been visiting the O'Leary, property earlier that evening for reasons he didn't want to make public. The O'Leary family themselves provided additional pieces to the puzzle, but their accounts also raised questions. Patrick O'Leary claimed he was in bed when Sullivan alerted them to the fire, but other witnesses placed him outside earlier in the evening. Catherine O'Leary was adamant that she was not in the barn and had not been milking any cows, but she was less clear about exactly what she had been doing at the time the fire started. The couple's son, James O'Leary, was about 18 years old at the time and gave several different versions of events over the years. In some accounts, he was the first family member to respond to Sullivan's alert. In others, he was already aware of the fire before Sullivan arrived. James later became something of a local celebrity, partly due to his association with the fire, and his stories became increasingly dramatic and detailed as he got older, making it difficult to separate fact from embellishment. One of the most persistent alternative theories involves a group of men who may have been gambling in the O'Leary barn that evening. Several witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar men in the area earlier in the day, and gambling was a common activity in working-class neighborhoods like the one where the O'Learys lived. Barns provided private spaces where men could gather to play cards, dice, or other games without attracting unwanted attention from authorities or disapproving family members. The gambling theory suggests that these men were using the barn as a meeting place, perhaps with or without the O'Learys' knowledge, and that a carelessly handled lamp, candle, or cigar started the fire. When the flames began, the gamblers would have fled immediately to avoid being identified and possibly charged with illegal gambling activities. This would explain why no one came forward with information about the fire's true origin, and why the early witnesses' stories were so inconsistent. Supporting this theory is the fact that Sunday evening was a prime time for illegal gambling activities. Most businesses were closed, families were typically at home, and there was less chance of being discovered by authorities. The O'Leary barn would have been an ideal location, isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough to the house that the gamblers could watch for any signs that the family was moving around and might discover them. Another theory focuses on the O'Leary's neighbors, the McLaughlin family, who were hosting a party that evening. Several witnesses confirmed that there was indeed a gathering at the McLaughlin house, with guests arriving throughout the evening. The party was apparently a lively affair, with music, dancing, and probably drinking, all taking place just yards away from where the fire would start. Some investigators have suggested that one or more of the party guests may have wandered into the O'Leary barn, either looking for privacy, seeking to use the facilities, or simply exploring the property while under the influence of alcohol. A guest unfamiliar with the layout and the fire hazards might easily have caused an accident with a lamp or match. Like the gamblers in the previous theory, such a person would have had every reason to flee without reporting the incident. The McLaughlin party theory is supported by the fact that several of the party guests were among the first people on the scene after the fire was discovered. They seemed to appear remarkably quickly and in surprisingly large numbers, which could suggest that some of them were already in the area when the fire started. However, their quick response could also be explained by the fact that they were simply nearby and sober enough to respond effectively to an emergency. A more sinister theory suggests that the fire was deliberately set, though by whom and for what reason remains unclear. Arson was not uncommon in 19th century cities, where insurance fraud, personalbandit, and various criminal enterprises sometimes involved the deliberate burning of buildings. Chicago in particular had experienced a number of suspicious fires in the months leading up to the Great Fire, leading some people to suspect that organized arsonists were operating in the city. The deliberate fire-setting theory points to the suspicious circumstances surrounding several aspects of the fire's origin and early spread. The fire seemed to spread unusually quickly for a barn fire, even accounting for the dry conditions and strong winds. Some witnesses reported seeing multiple separate fires starting simultaneously in different parts of the city, which would be consistent with a coordinated arson campaign. However, the arson theory faces significant challenges. There's no clear motive for anyone to want to burn down the O'Leary barn specifically, and the perpetrators would have had no way to predict or control the massive fire that resulted. Most arsonists are looking for targeted destruction, not citywide catastrophe, and the Great Fire quickly grew far beyond anything that could have been planned or intended. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence in the mystery comes from the Chicago Fire Department's own investigation, conducted in the weeks following the disaster. Fire investigators noted several unusual aspects of the burn patterns around the O'Leary barn that didn't match typical accidental fires. The fire seemed to have started in multiple locations within the barn simultaneously, rather than beginning at a single point and spreading outward. This observation led investigators to suspect that accelerants may have been used, either deliberately or accidentally. Oil, alcohol, or other flammable liquids could have been present in the barn for legitimate reasons, but their distribution patterns suggested they may have been spread around intentionally. Unfortunately, the investigation was hampered by the fact that most of the physical evidence had been completely destroyed by the fire itself. The weather conditions on October 8, 1871, have also been scrutinized as a potential factor in the fire's origin. Chicago had been experiencing an unusually dry summer and fall, with very little rainfall for months before the fire. The humidity was extremely low, and strong winds from the southwest had been blowing steadily for several days. These conditions wouldn't have started a fire by themselves, but they would have made any ignition source much more dangerous than it would have been under normal circumstances. Some meteorologists have suggested that the extreme dry conditions might have created circumstances where spontaneous combustion was possible. Hay and other organic materials can generate heat as they decompose and under the right conditions. This heat can build up to the point where flames actually appear without any external ignition source. However, spontaneous combustion typically requires very specific conditions of moisture, temperature, and air circulation that probably weren't present in the O'Leary barn. The investigation was further complicated by the fact that Chicago's fire prevention and investigation systems were primitive by modern standards. There were no forensic fire investigators, no scientific analysis of burn patterns or accelerants, and no systematic preservation of physical evidence. Most of what we know about the fire's origin comes from witness testimony, which is notoriously unreliable, especially in traumatic situations. The passage of time has made the mystery even more difficult to solve. Many of the original witnesses died without ever giving complete or consistent accounts of what they saw. Others may have taken secrets to their graves, either to protect themselves or others from embarrassment or legal consequences. The physical location where the fire started has been built over multiple times, eliminating any possibility of archaeological investigation. Modern fire investigators who have reviewed the historical evidence have identified several likely scenarios, but none can be proven definitively. The most probable explanations involve some form of human carelessness, a dropped cigar, an overturned lantern, a spark from a pipe, or similar accident. The exact circumstances may have involved Sullivan, the mysterious gamblers, party guests from the McLaughlin gathering, or even members of the O'Leary family themselves. What makes the mystery particularly frustrating is that the true cause probably wasn't dramatic or unusual at all. Most likely, the Great Chicago Fire started the same way thousands of smaller fires started every year, through simple human carelessness in a situation where the consequences were amplified by extraordinary circumstances. A moment's inattention that would normally have resulted in a small, easily controlled fire instead became the spark that destroyed a city. The drought conditions, the strong winds, the combustible construction materials, and the inadequate firefighting resources all combined to turn what should have been a minor incident into an unstoppable disaster. The real mystery isn't so much what started the fire, but why this particular fire, on this particular night, in this particular place, became so much more destructive than the hundreds of similar fires that occurred without major consequences. The unknown origin of the Great Chicago Fire has become part of its legend, adding an element of mystery and speculation that has kept the story alive in popular imagination for more than a century and a half. People continue to propose new theories, investigate old evidence, and debate the various possibilities, partly because the truth remains genuinely unknown, and partly because the mystery itself has become an integral part of the historical narrative. Perhaps the most important lesson from this unsolved mystery is how little we actually know about many of the pivotal events in history. We tend to assume that major historical incidents were carefully documented and thoroughly investigated, but the reality is that many of the most significant moments in human history remain poorly understood, even when they occurred relatively recently and in places with extensive written records. The mystery of the Great Chicago Fire's origin reminds us that history is often messier, more uncertain, and more open to interpretation than we like to admit. Sometimes the most honest answer to the question, what really happened, is simply, we don't know, and we probably never will. In a world that values certainty and clear explanations, admitting ignorance can be uncomfortable, but it's often more accurate than pretending we have answers we don't actually possess. The psychological impact of not knowing the fire's true origin affected the survivors and the broader Chicago community in profound ways. Without a clear explanation for why their world had been destroyed, many residents struggled to make sense of the disaster and their own survival or losses. Human beings have a deep need to understand cause and effect, especially when it comes to traumatic events, and the absence of a definitive explanation left many people feeling unsettled and vulnerable. This uncertainty also influenced how Chicago rebuilt after the fire. City planners and architects had to make decisions about fire prevention and building codes without fully understanding what had gone wrong the first time. They knew the fire had spread quickly through wooden structures, so they mandated more use of brick and stone. They knew the fire department had been overwhelmed, so they expanded and reorganized it. But without knowing exactly how the disaster had begun, they couldn't be certain they were addressing the right problems. The mystery also became entangled with the broader social and political tensions of Reconstruction-era America. Different ethnic and class groups in Chicago had different theories about the fire's origin, and these theories often reflected their existing prejudices and conflicts. Irish immigrants suspected they were being scapegoated. German residents blamed careless Americans. Wealthy citizens pointed fingers at the poor, and working-class residents suggested the fire might have been set by business interests looking to collect insurance money. Some of the more exotic theories that emerged over the years reflect the limitations of 19th-century scientific understanding. A few people seriously suggested that the fire had been caused by fragments from a comet, since astronomers had observed unusual celestial activity around the same time. Others proposed that underground coal deposits had somehow ignited spontaneously, A handful of religious leaders claimed the fire was divine punishment for Chicago's sins, particularly the city's reputation for vice and corruption. These fringe theories might seem amusing now, but they illustrate how desperate people were to find some explanation. Any explanation for an event that seemed to defy rational understanding. The idea that a small fire in an immigrant family's barn could destroy an entire major city was almost too improbable to accept, leading people to search for more dramatic or supernatural causes that seemed proportionate to the scale of the destruction. The advent of modern forensic science has allowed investigators to take fresh looks at the historical evidence, but the passage of time has eliminated most of the physical clues that contemporary methods might have been able to analyze. Fire investigators today can determine the point of origin for most fires with considerable accuracy, identify accelerants, and even sometimes reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to ignition. But these techniques require physical evidence that simply no longer exists for the Great Chicago Fire. Archaeological investigations at the site of the O'Leary property have uncovered some artifacts from the 1870s, including fragments of glass, metal, and ceramic that survived the fire. However, none of these items provide clear evidence about how the fire started. The intense heat of the blaze destroyed most organic materials and altered the chemical composition of many surviving fragments, making it impossible to determine whether accelerants were present or how the burning process began. Modern computer modeling has allowed researchers to simulate the fire's spread under various scenarios, testing different theories about its origin and early development. These simulations have confirmed that the weather conditions on October 8th were indeed extreme enough to allow a small fire to grow into a citywide conflagration very quickly. They've also shown that the fire's rapid spread was probably inevitable. Once it reached a certain size, regardless of its specific starting point. The modeling studies have also revealed some interesting patterns in how the fire moved through different neighborhoods. The destruction wasn't random or uniform, but followed predictable paths based on wind patterns, building density, and the availability of combustible materials. This information has helped historians better understand which areas of the city were most vulnerable, and why some buildings survived while others didn't. DNA analysis and other modern techniques have been applied to some of the surviving artifacts and documents related to the fire. But so far, these investigations haven't yielded any breakthrough discoveries about its origin. The hope is that as forensic technology continues to advance, new methods might eventually be able to extract information from evidence that current techniques cannot analyze effectively. The mystery has also been examined through the lens of modern disaster psychology and crowd behavior research. Scientists who study how people respond to emergencies have noted that the witness accounts from the Great Chicago Fire follow patterns that are typical of traumatic situations. People under extreme stress often have difficulty accurately perceiving and remembering details, which could explain why the various witness testimonies are so inconsistent and contradictory. This psychological research suggests that even if we had perfect access to all the original witnesses, we still might not be able to determine exactly what happened. The human mind simply isn't designed to function as a reliable recording device during life-threatening emergencies, and the people who saw the fire's beginning were operating under conditions of extreme stress that would have compromised their ability to observe and remember accurate details. The enduring fascination with the fire's mysterious origin has made it a popular subject for amateur historians and conspiracy theorists. Online forums and social media groups regularly debate the various theories, sometimes proposing new explanations or challenging established facts. While most of these discussions don't lead to serious historical insights, They demonstrate how the mystery continues to capture people's imaginations more than 150 years after the event. As we settle into the final portion of our exploration of this great urban disaster, we're left not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and uncertainty that surrounds even the most studied events in human history. The Great Chicago Fire started somehow, somewhere, for some reason. But the specific details of that beginning may remain forever lost in the smoke and ash of time. When money couldn't buy safety, the elite experience of the Great Chicago Fire. We've explored the deadly reality of surviving the fire as a common citizen, uncovered the tragic injustice done to Catherine O'Leary, and investigated the enduring mystery of the fire's origin. Now, in our final segment, we turn our attention to a different perspective on this great urban disaster. What it was like to experience the Great Chicago Fire as a member of Chicago's wealthy elite. This isn't a story of privilege protecting people from catastrophe, but rather a fascinating study of how even unlimited resources and social connections proved utterly useless when an entire city was burning down around everyone equally. Chicago in 1871 was a city of stark contrasts. While working-class families like the O'Learys lived in wooden cottages and frame houses that could burn down in minutes, the city's wealthy elite had constructed elaborate mansions of brick and stone, surrounded by manicured gardens and protected by wrought iron fences. These were the merchant princes, railroad barons, and industrial magnates, who had built their fortunes on Chicago's explosive growth as the hub of America's expanding western frontier. The wealthy districts were concentrated primarily on the north side of the city, in neighborhoods like the near North Side and what would later become the Gold Coast. Here, along streets like Michigan Avenue, State Street, and the lakefront, stood the palatial homes of Chicago's first families. These weren't just houses, they were statements of power and permanence. Built with the finest materials money could buy and designed to last for generations. Men like Potter Palmer, the real estate and retail magnate, lived in a massive limestone mansion that occupied an entire city block. Marshall Field, the department store king, had constructed an elaborate Second Empire-style mansion complete with a conservatory, ballroom, and servants' quarters that housed dozens of staff members. These homes were filled with priceless art, imported furniture, libraries containing thousands of books, and wine cellars stocked with the finest vintages from around the world. On the evening of October 8, 1871, Chicago's elite were going about their usual Sunday routines. Some were attending evening services at fashionable churches like the Second Presbyterian Church or Trinity Episcopal, where the city's most prominent families maintained their pews. Others were hosting dinner parties in their grand dining rooms, entertaining guests with multiple course meals served on imported china and accompanied by the finest wines and spirits. The first signs that something was wrong came not from the fire itself, but from the unusual behavior of their servants. Maids, footmen, cooks, and coachmen who lived in working-class neighborhoods closer to the fire's origin began receiving word from friends and relatives that something terrible was happening on the south and west sides of the city. These servants, many of whom were Irish or German immigrants, had networks of communication that often moved information faster than official channels. Initially, the wealthy residents weren't particularly concerned. Chicago had fires regularly, and the fire department, while not perfect, had always managed to contain them before they reached the better neighborhoods. The rich districts were separated from the working-class areas not just by geography, but by the Chicago River, which seemed like an effective natural firebreak. Surely, they reasoned, whatever was happening in the immigrant neighborhoods would be contained long before it could threaten their stone and brick mansions. This confidence began to erode as reports filtered in throughout the evening. The fire wasn't just bigger than usual, it was spreading in directions that fires weren't supposed to spread. The wind was carrying burning debris across the river, starting new fires on the north side. Buildings that were supposed to be fireproof were burning anyway. The downtown business district, where many of the elite had their offices and commercial interests, was directly in the fire's path. By late evening, when the scope of the disaster was becoming clear, Chicago's wealthy families found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being genuinely frightened. These were people accustomed to controlling their environment, to having solutions for every problem, to being able to buy their way out of any difficulty. But money couldn't stop a fire, social connections couldn't change the direction of the wind, and all the influence in the world couldn't make brick and stone less combustible when exposed to intense enough heat. The first instinct of many wealthy families was to try to protect their possessions. Unlike working-class families who might own a few treasured items, the elite had houses full of valuable objects that represented not just monetary worth, but family history and social status. Paintings by famous artists, jewelry passed down through generations, rare books, antique furniture, silver services, china sets. These weren't just possessions, they were symbols of everything their owners had worked to achieve. But the logistics of protecting or evacuating such treasures quickly proved overwhelming. A single painting might require several men to move safely, and the wealthy families owned dozens of them. China services included hundreds of individual pieces. Libraries contained thousands of books. The wine cellars alone represented collections that had taken decades to assemble. Even with full staffs of servants, moving these collections would have taken weeks under normal circumstances. As the fire drew closer to the fashionable districts, panic began to set in among people who weren't used to feeling helpless. Servants were dispatched to local banks and safety deposit companies to retrieve important documents and jewels, only to discover that many of these supposedly secure facilities were themselves under threat or had already been evacuated. Safe deposit companies that charged premium prices for protecting valuables found there. Fireproof vaults weren't nearly as fireproof as advertised. The transportation systems that the wealthy relied upon broke down almost immediately. Private carriages became useless as streets filled with debris and fleeing crowds. The elite families who owned multiple horses and vehicles found their drivers reluctant to risk their lives, navigating through smoke-filled streets toward uncertain safety. Some coachmen simply abandoned their posts, choosing to look after their own families rather than risk their lives protecting their employer's property. Railroad connections, which might have provided escape routes for those with the right connections, were disrupted as tracks were damaged by heat and debris. The wealthy men who sat on railroad boards discovered that their influence meant nothing when the infrastructure itself was being destroyed. Ships on Lake Michigan offered potential escape routes, but the lakefront was chaotic with thousands of refugees, and even first-class passengers found themselves competing with desperate families for limited space. Communication systems failed just as completely for the rich as for the poor. The telegraph lines that connected Chicago's business elite to their networks across the country went dead. As the fire consumed the central telegraph office, wealthy families who were accustomed to sending messages across the continent in hours found themselves unable to communicate with relatives in the next neighborhood. Perhaps most unsettling for Chicago's elite was the breakdown of the social order they had worked so hard to establish and maintain. In their normal lives, their wealth and status provided them with deference, respect, and preferential treatment in every aspect of daily life. But disasters have a way of equalizing human experience, and the Great Chicago Fire was no exception. Suddenly, wealthy matrons found themselves standing in the same refugee lines as immigrant families, waiting for the same basic necessities of food, water, and shelter. Their fine silk dresses and expensive jewelry marked them as targets for robbery rather than objects of respect. Their refined manners and cultured speech patterns, normally sources of pride and social advantage, seemed irrelevant and even ridiculous in the face of immediate survival needs. The psychological shock of this social leveling was profound. These were people who had spent their entire lives in environments where their comfort and security were maintained by layers of servants, institutions, and social structures designed to protect them from life's unpleasantness. Suddenly finding themselves as vulnerable as everyone else was a trauma that would affect many of them for the rest of their lives. Many wealthy families made the same mistakes as their poorer neighbors, just on a grander scale. They wasted precious time trying to save too many possessions, organized inefficient evacuations that prioritized objects over lives, and trusted in resources and connections that proved worthless in a true emergency. Some wealthy men spent critical hours trying to reach their offices or businesses to save important documents or cash, only to find the downtown area already consumed by flames. The servants of wealthy families faced particularly difficult choices during the disaster. Their livelihoods depended on their employers, but their primary loyalties were often to their own families and communities. As the fire spread, domestic workers had to choose between staying to help their wealthy employers evacuate or rushing to aid their own relatives in more immediately threatened neighborhoods. Many chose family over employment, leaving their wealthy employers to fend for themselves for perhaps the first time in their privileged lives. Some of the most poignant stories from the fire involve wealthy families discovering that their money and status meant nothing when it came to the most basic human needs. Prominent businessmen who were accustomed to fine dining found themselves grateful for crusts of bread. Society ladies who had never performed physical labor found themselves digging through ruins with their bare hands, looking for any salvageable possessions. Children who had been raised by nannies and tutors found themselves sleeping on the ground with no one to care for them but their own parents. The experience was particularly traumatic for the women of elite families. Upper-class ladies in 1871 lived highly sheltered lives, protected from most of the harsh realities of urban existence by wealth, social position, and elaborate codes of proper behavior. They were expected to be delicate, refined creatures who concerned themselves with fashion, literature, and social gatherings rather than the practical aspects of survival. The Great Fire forced these women to confront situations they had never imagined and were completely unprepared for. They had to make life or death decisions without consulting husbands or male relatives who might be trapped elsewhere in the city. They had to protect their children in environments that were physically dangerous and socially chaotic. They had to perform physical labor, deal with crude and desperate people, and manage on their own in ways that their entire upbringing had taught them was inappropriate and impossible. Many wealthy families lost not just their homes and possessions, but the entire foundation of their social identity. A merchant prince whose business district mansion was reduced to ashes wasn't just homeless, he was nobody. The social structures that had defined his place in the world had literally gone up in smoke. Some never recovered from this psychological blow, spending the rest of their lives as shadows of their former selves, unable to rebuild not just their fortunes, but their sense of who they were. The elite districts didn't burn uniformly. The fire's path was influenced by wind patterns, building materials, and the spacing between structures, meaning that some blocks were completely destroyed while others suffered only minor damage. This randomness was perhaps even more disturbing to the wealthy than complete destruction would have been. because it emphasized how little control they actually had over their fate. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years, attending the same social functions and belonging to the same exclusive clubs, found themselves in completely different circumstances based purely on chance. One family might lose everything while their next-door neighbors escaped with their mansion intact. The fire's arbitrary nature challenged fundamental beliefs about merit, divine favor, and the relationship between virtue and prosperity that formed the foundation of elite social philosophy. The immediate aftermath of the fire was particularly difficult for Chicago's former elite. The social institutions that had structured their lives, the exclusive clubs, fashionable churches, cultural organizations, and business associations, were either physically destroyed or too disrupted to function normally. The restaurants where they had dined, the theaters where they had been entertained, the shops where they had purchased luxury goods, all were gone. Many wealthy families found themselves living in conditions they hadn't experienced since childhood, if ever. They crowded into temporary shelters, shared facilities with people they would never have associated with under normal circumstances, and depended on charity from organizations they had previously supported as philanthropic gestures rather than personal necessities. The long-term impact on Chicago's elite was profound and varied. Some families were completely ruined, their businesses destroyed and their fortunes wiped out. Others, particularly those with diversified investments outside of Chicago, were able to rebuild and even profit from the reconstruction boom that followed. A few discovered that the fire had actually improved their positions by eliminating competitors or creating new opportunities in the rebuilding process. But even those who recovered financially often bore psychological scars from the experience. They had learned that wealth and status provided no guarantee of security, that the comfortable world they had created for themselves could disappear overnight, and that they were just as vulnerable to disaster as anyone else. This knowledge changed how many of them lived the rest of their lives, making them more cautious, more aware of the fragility of their position, and sometimes more sympathetic to those less fortunate than themselves. The Great Chicago Fire served as a great equalizer, proving that when nature or accident unleashes truly destructive forces, human social hierarchies become meaningless. The wealthy discovered that their money couldn't buy immunity from disaster. Their social connections couldn't protect them from forces beyond human control, and their refined lifestyles had left them just as unprepared for real emergency as anyone else. In many ways, the elite experience of the Great Chicago Fire illustrates a fundamental truth about human existence. We are all more vulnerable than we like to admit, and the systems we create to protect ourselves from uncertainty and danger are much more fragile than we want to believe. The fire stripped away the comfortable illusions that allowed Chicago's wealthy to feel secure and superior, leaving them face to face with the same basic survival challenges that have confronted humans throughout history. The insurance industry, which had provided another layer of security for the wealthy, proved to be yet another broken promise during the aftermath of the fire. Many elite families had invested heavily in fire insurance policies, believing these would protect their investments even if disaster struck. However, the scale of the Great Chicago Fire overwhelmed the insurance companies just as completely as it overwhelmed every other institution designed to provide security and stability. Insurance companies that had seemed rock solid before the fire found themselves facing claims that exceeded their total assets by enormous margins. Many simply declared bankruptcy rather than attempt to pay the massive claims resulting from the fire. Others engaged in lengthy legal battles, challenging claims on technical grounds, or arguing that the fire constituted an act of God that voided their policies. Wealthy families, who had paid premium prices for comprehensive coverage, discovered that their policies were worthless pieces of paper when they needed them most. The legal aftermath was particularly bitter for Chicago's elite, who were accustomed to using the court system to protect their interests. Lawsuits flew in every direction as insurance companies, property owners, businesses, and individuals all tried to shift responsibility and financial burden to someone else. The courts, already overwhelmed by the practical challenges of operating in a partially destroyed city, became clogged with thousands of cases that would take years to resolve. Many prominent families found themselves embroiled in legal disputes that consumed what remained of their resources and energy. Men who had once wielded considerable influence in Chicago's business and legal communities discovered that their reputations and connections meant little when everyone was facing similar disasters. The social networks that had once smoothed business dealings and legal problems were disrupted by the fire's impact on the elite community itself. The rebuilding process revealed new dimensions of how the fire had changed Chicago's social landscape. Some wealthy families who had lost everything chose to leave Chicago entirely, relocating to other cities where they could start over without the constant reminders of their losses. Others stayed, but found that the Reconstruction boom had created new centers of power and influence, displacing some of the old elite families with newcomers who had the capital and connections to take advantage of rebuilding opportunities. The architectural choices made during Reconstruction also reflected the trauma the elite had experienced. The grand wooden mansions that had symbolized wealth and success before the fire were largely abandoned, in favor of stone and brick construction that prioritized fire resistance over aesthetic appeal. The new mansions built by recovering elite families were often more fortress-like than their predecessors, reflecting a new awareness of vulnerability and a desire for security over ostentation. The fire also changed the relationship between Chicago's elite and the rest of the city's population. Before the disaster, the wealthy had often viewed the working class, neighborhoods with a mixture of paternalistic concern and social distance. The shared experience of the fire, however, created a more complex dynamic. Some wealthy families developed genuine empathy for the struggles of ordinary people, having experienced similar losses and uncertainties themselves. Others, however, became more defensive and exclusionary, retreating into even more isolated social circles as a way of coping with the trauma of having their sense of superiority challenged. The fire had revealed that the social hierarchies they had constructed were more fragile than they had believed, and some responded by trying to rebuild those hierarchies even more rigidly than before. The children of elite families were particularly affected by witnessing their parents' vulnerability during the fire. Young people who had grown up assuming that wealth and status provided security had seen their parents reduced to the same desperate circumstances as everyone else. This experience shaped their worldview in ways that would influence Chicago's social development for generations. Some became more socially conscious, dedicating their lives to charitable work and social reform as a way of addressing the inequalities the fire had revealed. Others became more cynical, concluding that if even wealth couldn't provide security, then the pursuit of power and control was the only rational response to life's uncertainties. The religious impact on elite families was also significant. Many had attended fashionable churches where sermons focused on prosperity as a sign of divine favor and moral virtue. The fire challenged these comfortable theological assumptions, forcing wealthy families to grapple with questions about suffering, divine justice, and the meaning of material loss that their privileged lives had previously allowed them to avoid. Some found genuine spiritual transformation in the aftermath of the disaster, developing deeper religious convictions and a more humble understanding of their place in the world. Others experienced crises of faith, unable to reconcile their losses with their previous beliefs about divine providence and moral order. The fire had theological implications that rippled through Chicago's religious communities for years afterward. The social clubs and cultural institutions that had defined elite society before the fire were slow to recover. And when they did, they often had different memberships and different priorities. The Union Club, the Chicago Club, and other exclusive organizations had to rebuild, not just their physical facilities, but their social functions and cultural significance. Some members who had lost their fortunes could no longer afford membership, while new wealthy families who had profited from Reconstruction sought admission to these symbols of social status. The fire also accelerated changes in gender roles within elite families. Upper-class women who had been forced to take charge during the emergency often found it difficult to return to their previous roles as passive dependents. Having proven their capability in crisis situations, many sought greater involvement in family, business decisions, charitable activities, and social reform movements. The fire had shown them that their sheltered lives had left them unprepared for real challenges, and many were determined not to be so vulnerable again. The Great Chicago Fire marked the end of one era in the city's social development and the beginning of another. The old elite, based primarily on early commercial success and social connections, gave way to a new elite based more on industrial wealth and professional expertise. The fire had destroyed many of the physical and social structures that had supported the old order, creating opportunities for new forms of wealth and influence to emerge. As we conclude our exploration of the Great Chicago Fire, we're left with a deeper understanding of how disaster affects all levels of society, revealing both the artificial nature of many social distinctions and the universal human experiences of fear, loss, and the struggle to survive when everything familiar suddenly disappears. Whether you lived in a wooden cottage or a limestone mansion, whether you were an Irish immigrant or a railroad baron, the fire treated everyone with the same ruthless indifference, reminding us all that, in the face of nature's fury, we are far more alike than different. The story of the Great Chicago Fire isn't just about one city's worst day. It's about the human condition itself, about how we respond when our assumptions about safety and control are proven catastrophically wrong. It reminds us to appreciate the fragile stability of our daily lives and to remember that disaster, when it comes, makes equals of us all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of America's most devastating urban disasters. As you settle into sleep tonight, safe in your modern, fire-resistant homes with working sprinkler systems and professional emergency services just a phone call away, perhaps you'll have a deeper appreciation for the security we too often take for granted. The Great Chicago Fire happened more than 150 years ago, but its lessons about human vulnerability, social justice, and the fragility of civilization remain as relevant today as they were on that terrible October night when a great city burned and changed forever. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that sometimes the most boring history carries the most important truths about who we are and how we live together in this uncertain world.